quiet so the people online can hear. I'd like to thank people who've joined us online. Thank you for being here as well. The title for the talk today is The Steward's Joy, imagining the steward's experience of freedom and celebration or joy and meaning in the experience of being a steward. And my aim for this presentation today is to elicit in you, among us, the sense of what it would mean to be a steward as the basic orientation in your life. As the whole way that you approached your life and the things you had and your own self and your life in the world, to imagine yourself fundamentally as a steward. I would love it if a few of you left, if half of you left, if all of you left, wondering, gosh, that really is a different way of thinking of myself and my way of being in the world. I wonder if I would like a little bit of that as well. I would like to grow a little bit more into this mindset, this basic orientation of being a steward. And a caveat I'd like to make as I begin is that I'm very aware, as I spent time this week preparing this presentation, that I am not one who lives in this mindset a whole lot myself. So instead of living in gratitude for the gifts that have been given to me and ordering them to God's purposes in a joyful sense of meaning and freedom, I can tend to feel a little hard done by life and a little afraid. And in that sense, the best thing to do is to get a little defensive or a little aggressive, but definitely not to see myself as a steward, as someone mediating between God and the good things of this world. So I really offer this as an opening reflection for my own life and for yours, wondering about the steward's joy, wondering about this new possibility of really seeing ourselves as stewards. But there's a problem of talking about stewardship during the pledge campaign. Joy tends to kind of fall off the side, and it can be like, well, Robert's just going to schmooze me with a lot of high spiritual talk because he actually wants me to give a lot of money to the church. The feeling of a hidden motivation can really be there, a lack of honesty on the speaker, and I recognize that. And the way I'd like to deal with that is to say that yes, the financial pledging to the church is actually one aspect of our stewardship and care for the church as a whole. So the financial giving is one aspect of that. But then our care for the church as a place, as a community, is just one aspect of this larger invitation to be a steward in the whole of your life. So we're going to pan out from the pledge campaign and see it within a larger invitation from God to imagine your relationship with yourself and your world and with God in a wholly different way. And as I thought about that, I thought there's actually a kind of parallel here. Who here knows about the priesthood of all believers? You've heard that before? Priesthood of all believers? Well, that means, it's very big in the Protestant church. We don't like to be too hierarchical. But it means that all of us are called to be priests inside the priesthood of Jesus. All of us are called to be, what the priest does is the priest takes the cow or the goat and he offers it to God. That's the fundamental action of the priest, is offering the world to God. But there's also, kind of going backwards, the stewardship of all believers. That we're all called to be stewards, mediating between the stuff of our world and God by listening to God's purposes and gradually learning how to apply them to our world, our particular life situation, the place exactly now where you find yourself. Nothing theoretical about this. It actually gets all very practical. So I would love for you to see this. We're all called to be priests. We're all called to take the good stuff of this world and offer it to God and ask God's blessing on it. And we're all called to be stewards, to listen to God, to hear, and then to begin to wonder about how do we apply God's desire and God's dream to the stuff of our world, where we find ourselves right now. Be that in middle age, be that in young adulthood, be that in a nursing home, be that wherever you are, this wonder about stewardship. So let's first of all do the usual thing in all these presentations and get our terms defined. What exactly is a steward? And when I looked this up in the dictionary, I was amazed. There are all kinds of definitions of being a steward. So for instance, a flight steward. We're all called to be flight stewards. We're all called to give peanuts to each other. No. Has anybody ever heard the word manciple? This is awesome. This is the guy or the woman who bought food for the monastery or the school. A manciple. It's your new word for today. If you can say, I'm feeling very mancipulian today. A party marshal is also called a steward, the guy in charge of the big party. He's a steward of the party, making sure it all runs accordingly. But we mean, of course, as steward, a person who manages another's property for them, often employed to do so. All right, let's just stop and savor that definition a little bit, because there's a lot of stuff in there that I find very curious. Very curious. So, if we're stewards, that means we're in possession of something that's not ours. We might think it's ours, but it's not ours. Okay. So we're in possession of stuff. We have care of stuff that's not actually ours. The second point, and we're called to look after it according to the intention and goal of the one whose property it is. That's the whole point of being a steward. You're taking care of it for somebody else, but you're taking their intention and you're applying it to what you have care of. And what I find fascinating about this, and this is really cool, please take this away from this Sunday forum, there's a curious and lingering note of absence in the life of a steward. And we all feel that. The absence of God. If you say you are a steward, it's an affirmation that you have a sense that somehow God is not here as fully as God could be. Otherwise, he wouldn't need you to be a steward, or God's sheep would not need you to be a steward. So to say we're stewards is a bizarre affirmation that we experience absence. That we experience a sense that God is not actually in the world in a full way, in our lives in a full way. I find that just thrilling, actually, because it affirms we don't have to pretend that we always know that God is here and God is doing great stuff. A steward lives with a sense of, I don't know where the Lord is. I'm not here right now, but I've got possession of his stuff. There's an even curiouser note of cooperation and purpose coming from outside ourselves. So when I was a kid, I did this with my own kids, my dad would take me and put my feet on his feet, and he would dance with me by moving his feet. Therefore, we all do that, right, with our kids? And that was an initial experience of receiving the movement or the desire or the purpose of another's life into my own life, letting myself be moved by the desire of another. It's about dance. It's about listening. It's about cooperation. There's something here that is deeply rich and meaningful. That it's not about us seeking to do what we want with our lives, but we get to pick up on the freedom or the movement of another. Maybe God is doing this right now, and I'm cooperating. Or maybe I'm just being goofy. But it's about picking up on the movement and the desire of God and letting that move your own living and your own loving. And the last thing about this, there's a curious notion of faith and prayer in this, because faith has many definitions. But one of them is an openness to hearing and learning about the Lord's desire and trusting that it actually is the desire that leads to the goodness and fulfillment for our lives. So it's an openness. And then if we say we're going to let ourselves be moved by that desire, well, guess what that is? We call that prayer. The BCP defines prayer as responding to God with or without words, in action or whatever, something like that. Responding to God. So it means having that openness to what God's desire might be, and then letting that desire move you in your practical arrangements of your life now. So what's gritty, and therefore cool, about this whole notion of stewardship is that it's about a dance that is open to someone who's sort of not here, but is sort of, I can sort of learn about, and has actual practical applications for how I approach my relationships, my commitments, my priorities, my time, how I give my attention to things. So, this is all in this definition of being a steward. Now, stewards of note in history, I mentioned this guy last year. Anybody know him?
Yes.
Denethor of Gondor. So he was the high steward of the last great city of men and women. But, you know, it's Tolkien, so it was mostly men. And Denethor is famous in this is Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien. And Denethor was famous as basically the bad steward. The steward who basically fell in despair that there ever was a king, that the king would ever come back, that he was on his own, that the world was completely impossible. And so he despaired, he relied on himself, and he committed suicide in the end, and brought his city near to complete ruin, were it not for Gandalf, whom we all loved. So that was one steward of note. Other stewards of note are the guys on the left there. Well, it's the guys on the right. This is from the Gospel for today, also known as the wicked tenants. Not quite stewards, but they were the Lord over there with the little cross there. He built a vineyard, and he asked the tenants to take care of the vineyard and give him his fruit at the proper time. But when the servants in that middle there, when they went to get the fruit, well, they were stoned to death and killed and bludgeoned by the bad tenants, the wicked tenants. And if you haven't come to service yet today, you'll hear all about that from Liz. And there's actually a gospel promise inside of it. So just stay tuned. That's a biblical story of, again, bad stewards. They were in charge of the vineyard of God's presence of Israel for God's purposes. And when God wanted the fruit, they said, no, it's ours. Go away. And then the original stewards of all, Adam and Eve. Isn't that just the cutest darn picture? Well, if you look at it closely, you can look at it looking at each other. It's just perfect. It's just perfect. So those are, and if we listen to the creation story, we are really put on this earth as stewards. That nothing that we have here is ours. All of it is given to us by God. So if we go back to that original point of being a steward, that we're in possession of stuff that we don't actually own, and if we ask God about this, we would have some sense that, okay, hello, Mary, good morning, Edward, Bob, Gretchen, we're all here this morning. We're all breathing. We're seeing colors. We're tasting some donuts. This existence that we have, this feeling of being alive, this sense of being a self, this sense of the vividness of being doesn't even belong to you. When we say God is a creator, it's kind of what we're saying. But it goes back even to your basic sense of being, the thrum of your life. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you're like, have I died? It's all dark. I feel dead. I feel really dead. Then you're like, no, I feel something. The thrum of your being, God made. God owns. It's God's. So, if we ask God, you always want to text God, don't you? So what do I have that is really mine, God? Is like anything really mine? And God says, well, nothing. What do you think of that? If not even your very feeling of being alive, of being at all, belongs to you. If that feeling could be invaded and owned by another and open to the movement of another, we call that love, we call that intimacy, we call that heaven. That basic feeling of ourselves being owned and cherished by someone else. And of course, because we try to be good stewards or good Christians, and we hear this, we give God the thumbs up. Okay, all right, I'll go with it. So now we're getting into what I would call the soul of a good steward. Okay? The soul of a good steward starts with all this is gift. None of this had to be. None of us had to be here. Thanksgiving. Thank you. There's joy in that. It continues with accuracy, appreciation, and honesty. Now, you weren't ready for that. Like, what does that mean? We went from giving thanks to accuracy? It seems kind of bizarre. But here's the thing. If you think your life is fundamentally yours and you've got to get it right, you're going to have to deny all the stuff that tells you you're not getting it right. You can't really be honest if you think your life is your own and there's pressure on you to get everything right. Or as I wrote in my notes, there is something about belonging to God that liberates us from anxiety about ourselves, feeling that we aren't good enough or needing to deny or distort what is not so good about our lives. So if we just belong to ourselves and we're in charge of this Robert project, and God, I better get it right, and I'm really embarrassed of all those parts of me that aren't right, I better keep those quite hidden so nobody knows about them, and I've got to perform, and I've got to look right, and I've got to do the right thing. But if Robert doesn't belong to me, belongs to God, well, that is God's problem. And if God cherishes Robert, Gretchen, Betty, Chris, if God cherishes this that we are, suddenly we have distance from ourselves, right? This is God's thing. I'm God's thing, right? I have distance from it. And the question is, okay, so how do I put this reality that I call whatever, our names, how do I open this to God's purpose? I was reading about a poem, a poet, I think it was Elizabeth Bishop, and someone else said of Elizabeth Bishop that she was a consummate craftswoman, that she would start a poem, and if she thought it was a table, she tried to make a table, as it were, metaphorically with the poem. But when it didn't work out, didn't have enough wood, she realized, oh, it's really a chair. And she'd make a chair out of it, or then make a stool out of it. And there's something about that kind of detachment. Like, I may have all these dreams and thoughts about my life and what I need to be and where I need to go and what I want, where I want to get my self-worth. But if we get some distance from that, we can actually see what is there more accurately because we're not so invested in it. It belongs to somebody else. It belongs to God. It's God's thing. And my task as a steward is simply to order that in whatever way to what God desires. I find that really liberating, really thrilling. And that's what I mean by the steward's freedom. That you're no longer in your life. You have some distance from your life. And you can see it, and your task is to order it to God's purpose, the good and the bad. The steward needs to know what the Lord's about. Right? So the soul of the steward is listening and learning and responsive to God, wanting to learn what God's will is. And I regard this Christian life as a lifelong exploration into the increasingly bizarre, hilarious, poignant, tragic, awful, lovely point of God's connection with this world. It never ceases to be surprising and bizarre and lovely beyond anything that I've ever learned or ever imagined. It just keeps going. And most Christians can peter off in their lives because they haven't really been listening to what God really wants in their world. And then something begins to happen. You begin to have a sense of, so if I dance in this way, I'm actually part of God's dance in this world. Maybe for a moment, maybe for just a glimpse I get to see when that happened, when that grace was given and that happened in my life, and I did that, and that was the response. For a moment, God and I were doing the God thing together. It's collaborative. And then there was more learning. And so I'll give you an example of the continued learning. We discerned in this parish that we wanted to develop more nurturing and deep celebrative and collaborative relationships with Black churches in Hillsborough following 2020, right? So we had I did 2-3 years of development and relationship building, which I'm still in with some of the Black pastors in town. One of them is Dewey Williams over at Mount Bright. And so Lisa was planning a pilgrimage to Stagville. This was actually a year ago, not the new one. And went to Dewey. And hey, Dewey, we're doing this great thing. We're going to go to Stagville. We'd love to do it with your parish. And have this white-black kind of joint pilgrimage to Stagville. And he's like, no. It's like Blacks don't want to go somewhere and be told how bad they've been treated. They already know that. We're like, oh, we were stupid once again. But the relationship was robust enough that we can actually be in those conversations. That's what I mean by practical learning. You may think you know what God is doing, but you don't know what the world is. You don't know all that's going on in people's lives and communities, so we will do wrong things, and we need to be open to that learning. Well, what is the right thing? And the last thing, there are moments when the Lord does seem to be there, when the Lord seems to come, and that's moments when we have joy, because our humanity is finally open to what it's supposed to be. Again, we call that beloved community. So that's the soul of the good steward. Thanks, seeing things honestly, because you really don't even own yourself. Learning, co-working, learning, celebration. As I thought about this, I said, oh my gosh, we call this is life as prayer. This is life itself as prayer with all these aspects. Giving thanks, offering, learning to see things clearly, because a great part of the life of prayer is having all your delusions about yourself torn away, alas, or fall away, or just sloughed off. But part of prayer is about seeing things clearly and being honest. Of course, scripture, worship, Eucharist, learning about God, being in community, acting, working, learning, and celebrating. This is actually the life of prayer. Life of the steward, life of prayer. Life as an experiment. How do I live with God in my situation now? And if we can bear with this same slide one more time. This is what we've been doing for the past 2.5 years in the You Redeemed and We've Redeemed program. I didn't plan this when I started it, but as I was working on this form, I'm like, yeah, this is what we've been doing. We've been learning to give thanks, to say, wow, St. Matthew's actually belongs to God. And there's lots of good stuff here, and there's lots of really bad stuff in our history. Just plainly, frankly, really bad stuff, really inhuman stuff. Okay. But it all belongs to God, We give thanks for what it is now. We offer it back to God. And because we say that we are cherished and forgiven by God in infinite mercy within mercy, this place, with the good and the bad, can be ordered to God's purposes. God does not give up on us because we've had some bad stuff in our history. We can actually begin to tell our history with greater accuracy and appreciation and honesty. My metaphor to that, of course, again, is we have to put less sugar into the tea to make it palatable. A little less lemon. We can actually see it because it's not really about us, in a sense. It is about us, and it's not about us in the sense that this history of this community of faith has happened, and it's God's. And we don't have to be afraid of what we see there. We can be truthful and see how God is going to use that to open our hearts and to engage the world and to further God's mission. And then you just go around the circle. We've been receptive and learning about God's desire. So what is God's desire? It's a question for you all. What's God's basic desire? Donuts? I like donuts. I don't think that's God's desire for me, though. Maybe it is. Maybe he wants me to be fed. Anybody want to take a crack? What God's desire is?
Peace.
Peace? Why is peace good? Why not conflict? Because in conflict we stir competition and we get better. Peace. I'll agree with Jim. Peace. But why peace? What happens in peace? What happens in peace? Anybody?
Cooperation.
Cooperation. And why does what?
Understanding.
Understanding.
Acceptance of difference.
Acceptance of difference. So all this is going on in peace. And love. Someone said love. Someone used a big L word. Hey, darno. So I'm just going to take Jim's lead on this. Community. Anything else? It's probably enough to go on. So peace is a place where I'm not afraid of you. And you're not trying to harm me or get stuff from me or exert your power over me to extract stuff from me or to put your garbage on me. It's a place where we actually desire each other's mutual flourishing. So we trust. I can actually learn about what you're about. Instead of trying to control Edward to make him do what I want. Or like a vestry meeting. No. I can be more curious about the uniqueness of Edward or the person you are. I can see that. We can speak more clearly. And we all begin to recognize each other as the children of God, that we are unique and lovely and cherished and broken and sinful and good. We call this beloved community.
Do you think if we do that right, the gift is the joy?
I think joy is intense whenever two persons are present in this way. And there can be a deep sorrow that makes the connection, but there also is a joy that the connection was there. That's the purpose of God. Remember, God is not about making saved individuals. God is about opening us to each other in this new kind of being together. All right? We go around, we experience the meaning of the pilgrimages and the work with the black churches in town, all sense of this actually feels like God. This feels like something sacred. I mean, holy cow. Holy moly, book of baptism. It actually feels like God. Like this is it. In a really surprising way, more learning, and we say thank you, God, for being there. Soul of the Steward. Life is prayer. Our parish journey. So this is the summary slide. It doesn't end the presentation, but it's a summary slide. Holistic stewardship is a lifelong process, learning about God's desire for us in creation, how it connects with our situation now, and makes demands on our individual choices. It's a gradual yielding of our lives to this purpose. It's practical. It's about your life now. God's desire now, it involves us in prayer, in community, and learning, and surrendering, and work, and more learning and celebration. But the key thing about this all is that you don't belong to yourself. You don't have anything. And you want to order it to God's purpose. So, I'll pause there for a moment before we go into the last bit of the presentation. Any thoughts coming out of this? Questions?
One is, stewardship is really looking after other people and being over them. And then is it really involved looking after yourself? I mean, that may be a positive. Indirectly, that's the benefit of looking at other people. But when you're stewarding, aren't you only, your work is to really focus on other people?
I would say it's Stewardship 360, and so it includes yourself. And so the stewardship would begin with God has great desire for this world, God has great desire for this parish, God has great desire for all this, and one surrendering to that. But God has also a desire for you. And so part of your stewardship is to live your life in a way that you can do this work. And that means you are a steward of yourself, because as I said, you're not your own, you're God's thing. And so where this hits the fan for me, Edward, I was walking up the stairs yesterday thinking about this, was, so what if I'm not a guy? I'm just not made genetically or whatever, psychologically, to work 60 hours a week. What if I can't? What if this thing that God has made that I happen to call Robert at the moment is simply not capable of that? So my stewardship is to notice that limitation and to begin to exercise my care for this reality that I am in a way that's appropriate for what is actually there. Yeah?
Well, doesn't the practice of being a steward allow you to come to that realization? I mean, what I'm saying is that there's a sort of different idea about practicing what it means to be attentive to other people and learning yourself. I mean, if you're learning yourself, but if you're really stewarding, the one thing you're not doing, if you're doing a good job, is you're not thinking about what you're learning about yourself.
Oh no. So there is a process. I think what you're indicating is a process of really being attentive and caring to this world. And then secondarily discovering that you're a part of this world and there is a need to care for yourself. But it arises first out of caring for this world.
Yes, but they're implicit in a lot that I'm hearing about stewardship is really focusing on yourself. And that's what I'm trying to, I mean, even applies sort of in the campaign. I don't know, stewardship, it really didn't occur to me that that's what we were doing. I mean, it was like, let's get to work. That you weren't really sitting back and saying, what are people thinking? Where are they?
Uh-huh.
Rather than as a steward, it's like, how can we really convince people less than just listen to them?
I'm drawing a little bit of a blank.
Well, it sounds to me like steward means listening and standing back more than it is overseeing people and what they do.
Oh, right. That's really good. So, if this is applied, I started this out with your relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to see it at the most fundamental, basic level. And that will continue through everything. But it is the wondering about God is over here. I'm here. There's something over here that I want to open up to God's purposes and God's movement. I want to make this, whatever this is, more open to God's life and God's desire. And at a most basic level, that can be about ourselves. Now, so does the wise steward, does the wise rector, then this is a question of practical learning. Does the wise rector learn about, God's will is here. I'm here. The parish is here. If I just yell at them more, if I just tell them more what they have to do with all my rectorial authority, if I just manage them better, if I just manipulate them just a little bit, make them do what I know is right. Right? That's the first attitude. And we're wondering if, and Edward, you bring this out, that maybe part of that stewardship role is that sitting back and that listening to the reality of the other and seeing where God is active and present in their life and honoring that flourishing and wondering how it fits into the life of the community as a whole. Something like that. It's almost about the attitude of the stewarding. Is it about like demanding? Or is it about listening, nurturing, encouraging? Yeah? I'll leave it there for now. And Darnell.
I don't know if this will be helpful, but what I'm getting out of this talk is that our stewardship is an outgrowth of our own relationship with God. And so if we are stewardships of our own relationship with God, then that expands out into the...
Because we're listening, and the next point of this presentation is that we are offering to you as a special, particular instance in this large call to be a steward of everything, to be a steward of this parish. Okay. So it's a lifelong process growing to be stewards, and we're calling you to be stewards of this parish with your personal offerings of time, skill, and resources. Everything you give to the parish to make it function. And why that makes sense to offer that is, what do we do at St. Matthew's? St. Matthew's, as a Christian parish, is encouraging all that we've talked about. Life is prayer, listening to God, being on mission with others, learning about how that works well. St. Matthew's, simply as a Christian parish that is functioning fairly well at the moment, is a place where that life with God as priest and steward is being taught, is being nurtured, is opening for you. So it makes sense that as a particular instance in this lifelong holistic stewardship, we're asking you to take care of this place as well. And that doesn't mean we don't have faults, blind spots, broken spots, and all that. But we are a place that is striving and open and getting and growing in this, I'll say. That was an important switch on this pivot point. And so, guys, what are we stewards of here at St. Matthew's? And I wrote an article about this. I'm sure you've all read the blog. You're all checking into the blog and the website every day. Who raise your hand every day? Twice a day? It's much better than the New York Times. So, when we think about what we're stewards of, we think about, the buildings, right? That makes sense. The buildings and the grounds. Yeah, sure. They're not ours. Actually, the Diocese of North Carolina owns them all. Surprise. We don't even own them. So, we're stewards of this place. And we're going to keep it beautiful and lovely kind of as a sacramental opening to God, to really care for the buildings and the place. But we also care for the Christian faith. We are stewards. All of us are stewards here of the Christian faith, as it's given in the Anglican and Episcopalian traditions. You can go and get the Methodist version of this down the road, Presbyterian, or Lutheran, or Catholic, or whatever. But what we're doing here in the middle of Hillsborough is this place has a stewardly care for the goodness of the Christian faith given through the Episcopalian and Anglican traditions. It's kind of what we're up to. So we have that care. We're stewards of our history. We've been here for 200 years, and as we get ready for the bicentennial, we're very aware that, there's good and bad in history. There's faithfulness. There is tremendous hilarity in our history. Like the guy who faked his own death and a log was put in the coffin instead. If you don't know about that true story, stay tuned. I mean, there's absolutely hilarious stuff in our history, and amazing people and quirky people and bizarre rectors. And Ashes Mosley Curtis was known for collecting mushrooms, for God's sakes. So, and a great rector. He was an international fungologist. Teresa.
And a real fun guy.
And a real fun guy. Love the fun guy. But we have all this history, and part of our working with this in the Christian faith is to see where God has been active in it, where God has not. The Jewish people, what's so inspiring about the Old Testament is that they could have edited out all the bad stuff. They don't. They're writing in Genesis about all the really horrible stuff they did, and they just write it all down. This is part of our history as God's people. We did all this bad stuff over and over and over and over and over. And we did all this good stuff too. But we have charged this history as examples and a richness of God's life with us. We're stewards of our programs and our missions, our education, our outreach, and all this other stuff. And what else? I think that's all I had. Oh. We're also, this is really, really important, we're stewards of the fellowship and care we have with each other. There's something I call undertow in a parish. And undertow is when we all say, welcome to St. Matthew's, we're about love. And underneath that, there's backbiting, gossip, competition, jealousy. Right? I always ask, how much undertow is there in the community? Especially when I was coming here to interview about the job. How much undertow is there here? There is not much undertow at St. Matthew's. There's a lot of loving, a lot of goodness, but we can always make undertow. We can always just do something that just pulls the thread out of the sweater, a thread out of the sweater of community. And the care we have for each other. So those are all things we're stewards of. So we have this big notion of seeing our human existence as itself stewardly. God, world, God has desires. I get to know a little bit of what they are, and I might be a little bit wrong about that. But then there's this material to work with, and the application of that, and the care for things, and the care for people, and this care for this particular parish, and this particular place. And then within that particular focus right now is just the pledge campaign. And this is really strictly about money. This is about making the pledge to support all the other larger work of stewardship we do in this parish, which is about that larger issue of being stewards. And if you're new, wondering at St. Matthew's, there's all kinds of ways of giving. Dorothy may cover more of this next week. You have to come for Dorothy's talk. It's much more sprightly than mine. But you can always make a donation. And you can always give stocks, and you can all do this, and you can put it all on the plate. You can give me a call. But when you make a pledge, you're making a symbolic offering saying, St. Matthew's is the place, is the locus where I'm going to work on this fundamental conversion of my life to be a steward. My whole life. And part of this symbolic gift, which has real value, is making this pledge for this year not to have access to this amount of funds for the use of the church. The pledge. And it's tremendously helpful if we know that ahead of time, because then we can budget how many hours we have to give to the staff, and so on and so on. So it's practically very beneficial. Spiritually, it's a sacrament of your investment in this place. Like you thought, I think life would be better as a steward than as an autonomous agent out for my own good. Maybe. I mean, you could try it for a year. And if it doesn't work out, then we could be a church of people all trying to get their own good. Make lots of conflict. But the stewardly thing really opens us to each other. So I hope you got this. The basic model here is really big, really global, metaphysical, gigantic, comes down to this parish, where this is a particular way to begin to practice stewardship of your energy, your time, your skills, your loving, not to be mean to people, to be loving here, to be caring, all that stuff. Nurturing this community, listening to the gospel, going to the sacraments. And then within that, there is just this moment, this month, there is the pledge campaign, which we'll talk about, like in real nuts and bolts detail, just the facts, man, second year running, with Dorothy, our treasurer, next week. Because knowing the facts and being transparent about them is utterly critical to the trust in the community and part of our being stewards. So do you want to be stewardly, priestly? It's supposed to be both. It's not an option. But I do want to end by just encouraging you to think about your life like it's not yours, it's God's. God owns you. And what an amount of freedom that gives. God owns this thing. And I wonder how God might use that for God's purposes. Right now, as I have brunch, as I go home. It's all in God's hands. Thank you. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you this morning.